Hi, this is Debony Morgan. Welcome to The Spirit of Now, Zeitgeist's podcast, talking with spiritual leaders and thinkers who are breaking new ground. And today we certainly have one of those. That's Dr. Jerome Luba. He's referred to as the patient doctor because it was his own quest for neurological well-being that led him to specialize in complex, unresolved neurological cases. His practice explores how functional neurology, neuroplasticity, and the tools like the Enneagram can improve holistic well-being. Dr. Jerome created and released the first ever neuroscience-based model of the Enneagram in his book, The Brain-Based Enneagram. You are not a number. He's going to be leading a workshop for us at Zeitgeist, talking about his whole identity profile and how we're overlaying neurology with the Enneagram and what that means to us as we look at our entire identity. So welcome, Jerome.
Thank you so much. I think I might just take that intro and use it for the rest of the podcast I get the pleasure of being on. That was amazing. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you are very welcome. So give us some more background about what led you to study neurology in the first place.
Yeah, it's interesting. You don't go to your high school guidance counselor as an immigrant refugee kid from Africa, which we immigrated in the early 90s from Congo to the U.S., and say, I think I'm going to go from digital animation artist to full-time musician to healthcare provider. But I started having complex migraines as a senior in high school, a few years after my dad passed away, and my identical twin brother has never had them. And it ended up, over the course of the last 20 years, I've averaged a full-blown independent migraine once every 3 to 4 days, about 100 to 115 a year, recovery and headaches between, and about 2 weeks out of the year that are symptom-free, 2 total weeks of days, 14 to 15 days. And my wife and I got married when she was 19, I was 21, and in the first 5 years of our marriage, over the course of about 9 years from 17 to 26, first 5 years of our marriage, 21 to 26, we went to 21, 22 different specialty providers, spent 9 years trying to search for an answer, finally got diagnosed with what's called a pretty aggressive Chiari malformation, which is a brain hernia. The benefits and the consequences of being run over by a car when I was 8, 2 concussions in high school, and being hit by 2 drunk drivers before I was 21. So my head and my body had been through some rough spaces. But really the long story short was we found out I had a plumbing issue. I have compression on all 4 sides of my brainstem that obstructs the flow of CSF fluid into the brain, or CSF flow into the brain. And I'm pressure washing my brain on a regular basis as a result of that plumbing issue. It's kind of like putting your thumb on top of a hose pipe.
Wow.
And what ended up happening was no background in neurology, no background in healthcare, a couple years working at a mental hospital in Chattanooga, Tennessee for a bit, but no intent of being a doctor. But what ended up happening is we went through all of these specialty providers and then arrived at an answer where everybody said, we know what it is, but we don't know what to do with it except for a complex surgery we wouldn't recommend. And you're basically resistant to every pain medication we can give you. So when everything dried up in terms of solutions in a traditional world, went to a lot of alternative providers. And they were incredible at wellness and wholeness and rehab, but really, really rarely, and in my experience, never, found somebody who knew how to take on a complex case from a wellness perspective. So as a patient, I ended up being somebody who's stuck between the purgatory of a traditional model great at triage and damage control, drugs and surgery, and an alternative community great at wellness and rehab, but no one who knew how to rehab a complex case towards wholeness.
Wow.
Like, how do you kind of fit the mold if no one really wants to keep seeing you? You keep getting referred. So based on that, I always joke with everybody the only reason I became a doctor was because I couldn't find a good one, or I couldn't find one that knew how to work on me towards the goal of being healthier. So I ended up getting into a degree in chiropractic specifically, but then ended up getting board certified and board eligible in 7 other areas dealing with brain rehab, without drugs or surgery, what's known as functional neurology. So it's kind of like if you have functional medicine or integrative medicine, I'm a chiropractor, but I'm trained in neurology, and I co-manage most of my patients with brain injury and concussion specialty MDs. So I'm the only chiropractor in Atlanta that's board certified in this. It's not very common. But it's my lived experience and my confirmation bias of specifically taking on unresolved complex cases and learning how to fine-tune somebody's function, no different than a personal trainer would.
Right.
If you went into the gym and you met with a personal trainer and you were in the best shape possible or the worst shape possible, their goal is to figure out how to effectively help walk you towards a healthier version of yourself without drugs or surgery. I do the same thing, but our modalities are tied to things like balance and vision and sensation and touch and brain function. No different than an orchestra conductor conducting the orchestra and working through, well, is this a string section issue? Is it a percussion issue? Is it a woodwind or a brass? And then once you know the system, you can figure out the instrument. Once you know the instrument, you can fine-tune that instrument. And fortunately, the brain is really, really tunable. I mean, neuroplasticity and the capacity to change how we function as human beings is a tangible, relevant, scientifically proven truth at this point. We just get to play in that sandbox and help people do things like walk and talk and think clearly again.
Wow. So you're already thinking in terms of complex systems from a physiological standpoint.
Yeah.
And let me ask you one quick question before I move on to the Enneagram.
Sure.
But just as a little tidbit, as a thank you to people for listening to the podcast, what's one tip that we could all do every day to help our brains?
I think there is nothing more powerful than a single deep breath. And the reason I say that is, especially in Western culture, we're very unfamiliar with embodiment and somatic work.
Yeah.
Like most people don't realize they're actually in a real body. But the name of the game is really executive function. If your frontal lobe, your executive function, your ability to think clearly and feel effectively, your emotional intelligence and your intellectual intelligence, if you stop and take an intentional single deep breath, not only do most people automatically change their posture, but it causes them to slow down just a touch, and it causes them to be present in their body. And what it can do is it can create a domino effect for literally everything else turning on. A single deep breath is like having a crisis that you don't know about, and a healthy leader or an effective CEO stepped into the room and became available to the conversation. So a lot of the times folks are asking for really, really complex solutions when there's not even a leadership person present to the conversation.
Wow.
So
I
a single
love that.
a single deep
thinking
breath
of it
is
like that.
really, really helpful.
Well, let's give our listeners a moment to do that. So let's just do that real quick. Take a deep breath. Lovely. I start all of my therapy sessions like that. It kind of wigs people out on the first session, but then after 3 or 4 sessions, they always say they look forward to it.
Absolutely.
So I get the medical side of things. How did you connect all of this with the Enneagram?
Well, the funny thing is I encountered the Enneagram like most of us have through a really, really, really passive friend. And by that I mean unrelenting friend who knew. He said, I have no idea why this is important for you, but I feel like this is important for you. And fortunately, thanks to his tenacity, he shared an audio recording of about 10 hours of Richard Rohr going through the types. I'd never even read about the Enneagram, hadn't seen it, had no lineage, no bias, no background. But when he was going through it and explaining it, I said, this sounds a lot like basic brain function. And the more he keeps talking about the three triads and the 3 intelligence centers, as a functional neurologist, we're taught how the right brain, left brain, and the brainstem all intersect to give you the basics of literally every function as a human being. You need all 3 of them to intersect. Unique and distinct, but not separate. Right? So when I'm listening to this, I go, man, this sounds a lot like basic brain function. So I do what anybody else who's studying neuroscience does. You Google if there's any neuroscience on it. And I'm Googling it, and Google keeps auto-correcting the spelling and correcting the combination of words that I'm trying to put in, and nothing is coming up at all. And when you Google something and nothing comes up on Google, I even have screenshots where there's only 3 results, and the 3 results were completely irrelevant. Like, they're not even context appropriate. So when I'm looking at this going, well, this is strange. There's nothing that says how this works in the brain. And then I start looking. There's no neuropsychology resources. There's no neuroscience resources. There's no brain-based perspective. So what I ended up doing was I listen to the audio recordings. I do a couple of Google searches. Nothing comes up. So I ended up getting The Wisdom of the Enneagram by Hudson and Riso. And the very first time I saw the symbol, it's like this weird, surreal matrix kind of experience. It's like I learned Kung Fu. Is I looked at the symbol and I said, I think this is inverted. It should be flipped vertically, because if I leave it in this orientation, the brain's going to be upside down. So what I did was I flipped it 180 on the vertical and just rotated it down. So the gut trad's at the bottom, the head's on the left, and the heart is on the right. And overlaid some really basic structures of the brain, like the left brain, the right brain, the brainstem, put some keywords on there, and over the course of about 4 hours filled out this piece of paper with tons of neurophysiology and neuropsychology terms on top of the Enneagram. And my introduction to the Enneagram was having this immediate, spontaneous synergy of information from my neurology background and my chiropractic background and my personal spiritual background, to automatically say, if I want to use the Enneagram, I have to overlay the brain, the normal structures of a human brain on top of the entire Enneagram. So it can't be number specific. Mm-hmm. It has to be all 9 numbers simultaneously interacting with each other like a normal human experience. In neuroscience, they call it a connectome, where it's kind of like looking at a city pattern of traffic and going, if we're living in Atlanta and far north, somebody has an accident, can it impact everything in downtown, or vice versa? So you may not be present to that space, but you're impacted by someone else somewhere else.
Exactly.
And saying the same thing with, I fortunately didn't go into the Enneagram with a bias that it's a single system or a single number system. Same way in the clinical world, when I meet with a patient, I assume that they're allowed to have more than one problem. And all of us are allowed to have more than one problem. And we're also allowed to have more than one solution. But oftentimes that's because as a clinician, I specialize in people who've had my history, 20 plus specialists, and all of the specialists know how to treat the particular organ or system that they're trained in, but nobody evaluates the entire person to go, how do all of these systems intersect and interact and possibly interfere with each other? And if I look at you as a whole person from head to foot, mental, emotional, physical, relational, spiritual well-being together, collectively, do I have a higher probability of figuring out what's going on with you and resourcing you if I see you as a complex orchestra versus an individual instrument having a bad day? So it ended up being that exposure to, just really simply put, I put the brain on top of the Enneagram, saw it was upside down, rotated it vertically or flipped it vertically, and the last 9.5 years has been trying to say, is this crazy? Or is this possible? And does the actual function of who we are as a human being become more comprehensive, and do the resources become more relevant once we understand how the system properly works?
Yeah.
So trying to reverse engineer that idea.
Well, and it sounds like the feedback that you've gotten from everyone that's come across it has been 2 thumbs way up.
Yeah.
It was exciting when Richard Rohr was talking about yours as he's helping people understand the Enneagram in general and saying, okay, now here's the cutting edge. Right?
Yeah.
And here's what people are doing with this.
And you want to talk about surreal. I mean, it's like, I get introduced to it 10 years ago, listening to an audio recording, which is the first time I had ever heard Father Richard's voice. And now, 10 years later, he's sharing my work through his email. I'm just like, this very efficient, strong 2 heart is overwhelmed. That is for sure.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And just real quick for our listeners that may not know the Enneagram, we're kind of presuming that most people do, but it is, if somebody else were to describe it, they might describe it as a number system where you are one of these numbers based on certain characteristics. And so I just want to bounce that off of you, because you're saying you're not a number. We're looking at more holistically. And so the phrase that you use in the book, which I thought was intriguing, is the neuropsychology of identity.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So my definition for identity is that you are a sum total of every good and every bad thing that has ever happened to you, including your genetics and how you came into the world. So, we've had these old adages of, is it nurture or nature? Mm-hmm. It's actually nurture and nature and discipline-based conditioning. All of those things collectively make you not only who you are genetically, but how your genes express and change based in environment. That's epigenetics. And then also, what protocols and plans and processes do you reinforce as a person, right? So when we look at the Enneagram as a single number system, as a personality type, that would be like saying, even simply put, I live in Atlanta, but I don't go to the outskirts of Atlanta. There are no other towns. Or I live in Atlanta and I don't even know that there are other cities in the U.S. Or even bigger, I live in the U.S. and I don't even know that there are other countries or other continents.
Right.
So I always tell people, when you look at the Enneagram, first off, for anybody who comes from different spaces, there are lots of different approaches. The Enneagram is no different than healthcare with its different differentiations, or spiritual spaces with its doctrines and dogmas, or clinical practices where there's their own techniques. Everybody's got a way of doing it, and a lot of people are very, very confident that their way is the right way. But what I always explain to everybody is that whether you take an approach of doing motivation-based typing with helping people figure out their type based on motivation, or somebody uses a test to help take a test and evaluate kind of what your preference is. The analogy that I use is the most effective clinicians never make a diagnosis off of one piece of data. Mm-hmm. What they do is take really good diagnostics, like information from the exams. They apply that to a practical exam. They apply that to a case history with somebody that's motivational interviewing to understand what somebody's goals are. And they collectively synergize not only the tests and the diagnostics with their exam, with their case history, with everybody's goals. All of that collectively goes, well, what makes this person who they are? So when looking at the Enneagram, the neuropsychology is to say, okay, your personality type that you're most efficient in is a survival strategy, and so is everything else. So when we encounter in the world, you can often look at somebody's type and go, that type showed up for you because your brain and your lived experience and your bias has said, if you respond or perform or react in that particular way, especially subconsciously, does it give you a higher probability of survival? Is it built to protect you? Yeah, absolutely. These are all defense mechanisms or survival mechanisms. But when there is no threat, which version of you shows up? When you are safe, which version of you shows up? When you're doing self-medication versus self-gratification versus self-soothing, which version of you shows up? Mm-hmm. But looking at it and going, one number is one aspect of your identity. But your identity is comprised of all of the areas in the Enneagram, especially if you look at it as a whole brain functioning collectively. So I can't say, even if I'm originally from South Africa, I am a South African, but I live in Atlanta. I no longer live in South Africa. So what caused that shift? What caused that change? I think a lot of the challenge in the Enneagram world sometimes is they say your number cannot change. And anybody who says that has never worked with brain injury patients. Mm-hmm. Because if you have a significant enough brain injury, the field of neuropsychology was birthed based on a head injury by a guy named Phineas Gage, who was a railroad worker who had a brain injury due to a steel piece of rebar going through his skull and impacting the part of his brain that dealt with impulse control. And he became a Jekyll and a Hyde sort of person. Structurally, his brain was damaged and his personality changed. He woke up a different person. So if we know that a brain injury can change your personality, and we know that it doesn't necessarily, now the science is showing, it doesn't require a physical impact for your brain to have post-concussion-like symptoms. Like you can react like you've had a head trauma based off of grief, based off of somebody dying, based off of losing a job, based off of getting a diagnosis. So are we predisposed to certain things? Sure. But to say that our environment is not malleable means that we don't understand if the situation is significant enough and our body calls for it, we can change our survival strategies. Right. So it's trying to help understand that we are not, the idea of being in a fixed state and a simple person is really, really, really old science. And the new science goes, the more complex we are, the more capacity for change we have. And it was also helpful, for the sake of brevity, to say this, moving away from people being type descriptions and titles, so they over-identify with a number, to what is the motivation and the value that you pursue in order to increase your chances of survival. Like moving away from an 8 being a challenger to saying, based on your lifetime of lived experiences and your physiology, your strategy says, if I disrupt a space and I'm a first mover and I end up being a stronger force in the space that I'm in, I have a higher probability of survival. Whereas a 5, if I withdraw, gather information, understand what to do next, and then engage, does that give me a higher probability of survival? That doesn't make me an observer. That makes me somebody gifted in observation. So it turns it into a skill set rather than a job title.
Yeah.
So try to help with that and say, just because you're high in 7 energy and you're hyper enthusiastic doesn't mean that you're not capable of being a 4 and being compassionate and being able to exercise the capacity to authentically relate with people. That's not, authentic relating is not exclusive to someone who's a 4 in the Enneagram. That's a human experience. Unconditionally loving someone is not exclusive to a 2. That's a human experience.
Right.
So moving not only the psychology of how we interact, but also trying to evidence that these things, if they're true about how we interact as a person, we should be able to connect the dots not only from an actual anatomy standpoint, structurally, but from a functional standpoint in terms of how we integrate and how we utilize those spaces. Yeah,
that's really exciting. And that was one of the things that I loved about the book was your sort of relanguaging that and, making this paradigm shift. The quote that I wanted to bring forth, which is just sort of a summary of what you just said, is that you are not one thing, you are complex and multifaceted, you are interconnected. And this is a vital paradigm shift. So changing the language around that, and as well as the entire structural shift, was really exciting for me because it was a good first introduction to think of, I'm this number. Sure. But then to go to the next level and go, but you're not. Right. I mean, you're not just. It's so much more complex than that. Well, one of the things that I think people will learn when they come to the workshop is, we've talked about this conceptually, and what I didn't want to talk about, because we'll save that for people who want to come in person or people who want to read the book, is, okay, so how exactly do I apply this? Yeah. I know the Enneagram. Hopefully I've taken the RHETI test, the RHETI test at the Enneagram Institute. It's enneagraminstitute.com, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So I know my numbers. Yeah. I know the order of what my strengths are or what my go-to is. Yeah. And so what you're going to do with us in person is to sit us down and help us know what to do with that in order to understand our entire identity. Is that a fair way to say that?
Yeah, absolutely. And be able to show you that there are certain things that, based on a lifetime of lived experiences, you are prioritizing and moving towards, that you're efficient in for the sake that they help you to feel safe. And there are some things that are either unsafe or unrewarding, and as a result, you don't invest the time and energy in them the same way. It doesn't mean you don't have access to them and you don't have capacity. You just don't have utilization in the same way. Yeah. So it's a case of taking the language off the table of saying, I can't because, or you do because, and saying, what's my relative relationship to that space? Because it's innately in me. It doesn't mean that I engage in it. And in fact, sometimes it may mean that I struggle to disengage from it. So helping to kind of frame that out a little bit and going, if I knew that there were 9 core motivations and a lot of strategies around that, and I realized some things are really important and some things aren't, especially in the world that you work in terms of direction and counseling and connecting people to a healthier version of themselves, being in a space where you can increase your self-awareness and your personal relative relationship with a word or an environment that reproduces that type of experience can help you to really reevaluate, man, am I having a struggle with this particular place because of a lived experience that hasn't reoccurred in 30 years? Right. And I've got survival strategies and attachment styles, and take all of this new language around the psychology that we're understanding and going, man, I'm executing strategies that my subconscious has asked for decades that are no longer important and no longer necessary. So having those conversations is helpful. Right,
and especially, like you said, for people who have struggles with attachment and trauma. I loved how you pointed out in the book, you say that 95 to 97% of our identity is formed at a subconscious level. Yeah. Right? And then it's just a matter of the intensity, the duration, the frequency of whatever those experiences would be, positive and negative.
Yeah, both.
But that really speaks to trauma and early childhood experiences like attachment wounding, and
Absolutely.
so that this has such power.
Yeah.
It has such power to heal people. And so I really want to encourage people to come out. I have had the great opportunity of sitting with you on more than one occasion and learning from you. I think not only is this an amazing idea that you're sharing, but you're also a fantastic teacher. Knowing how our brains work as learners,
Sure.
You really do your best to keep people engaged. And I know it's going to be a delight for anybody that comes out.
That'd be awesome.
Any last words to kind of summarize that, or help us know what to expect?
No, I think, probably the biggest thing that I would say is, as with anything in personal development work, whether it be a personality type test, or it be spiritual direction, or it be increased self-awareness and self-growth, every single thing that we look at it around neuropsychology and our own identity, it's really helpful to remember everything is skills-based. And we don't come out of the womb with self-awareness. In fact, when we come out of the womb, we don't even know that we have hands and feet.
Right.
It's a very reactionary, reflexive kind of space. So the thing that I would encourage everybody with is that whatever stage and state you're at, as you start to learn this information, don't feel overwhelmed that you don't know exactly how to apply it. And oftentimes people will get intimidated that now it feels like you've got to learn more. Well, the reality is, there are no people that I know that effectively rode a bicycle the very first time they got on it. And there's nobody that went into the gym and effectively built stamina and strength in their muscles that they exercised on the first attempt. So as we start to discover more and more about who we are, the one phrase that's in the book that I'll say now and I'll repeat again at the workshop is, this is not about being less broken. It's about becoming more whole. And understanding that we have the capacity for these things, and as we discover more ways to engage our natural capacity, that is no different than realizing, oh my gosh, I have a lot of muscles in my arms that are different than my legs, and they each serve a purpose. I want to be healthy and strong in all of them. This is a chance to do that, so don't be intimidated by what feels like complicated spaces. I think it's an opportunity to respect and really be in awe of how complex we are made. And the more that we know about how we are made, the more we can understand how to utilize that effectively for a really healthy, long-term impact. So being encouraged that more information is actually a good thing. Yeah. And that's coming from somebody who's lowest in a 5, because everybody thinks on my work that I'm a 5. 5 is my lowest number, and if you come to the workshop,
isn't that interesting?
If you come to the workshop, I will explain to you exactly why that is.
Well, I'm a very high 5.
Yeah.
That's one of my go-tos. So I just love it. Give me more data.
Exactly. So it's good stuff.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Jerome.
My pleasure.
And let me encourage people to go to our website, which is zgatl.org, and right there on the front page you can connect to more information. We're going to be meeting on Saturday, April 4th, 9:30 to 3:30, and you can pick up a copy of the book and get it signed and learn a whole lot more from Dr. Jerome Lubbe. Thanks, and we'll see you there.
Thanks so much.